Choi Seo-yun curled into a small ball on the cold, asphalt ground behind the school gym, clutching and reclutching the frayed ears of the stuffed bunny keychain in her small hand. The fourth time she squeezed it, she prayed the shadows moving toward her would just disappear. But no mercy came. Mercy had never been shown by the boys in this corner of the playground. The crumpled detention slip tucked into her pocket gave her exactly zero protection. It was just a piece of paper, useless against the three figures towering over her. Her small fingers trembled as she felt the dirt grind into her knees. Outside the alleyway, the city of Seoul hummed with an indifference that felt like a physical weight. The wind lashed against the brick walls like angry fists. The school had never felt this terrifyingly empty. Seo-yun stared at the scuffed tips of Park Jae-hoon's expensive sneakers. One kick to the ribs, a shove to the shoulder, a handful of hair pulled tight. Her stomach twisted in a knot of pure fear, but she forced herself to stay silent. She'd gotten used to the bruises over the past 2 weeks. The overhead light in the alleyway flickered, casting long, monstrous shadows. She held her breath, praying anyone would walk by before the boys grew bored of just words. The final bell had rung an hour ago, and the silence was overdue for a breaking point. Everything was at a breaking point. Her phone, hidden deep in her backpack, buzzed with an automated text alert from the gardener. The private security line her father had told her to use only in the gravest of emergencies. She reached for it, but a heavy foot slammed down on her wrist, pinning her to the concrete. The heavy thud of a sneaker connecting with Seo-yun's ribs echoed through the narrow alleyway, a sound so dull and final it made Kim Ara press her palms over her mouth to stifle a sob. Huddled behind a row of rusted, overflowing industrial dumpsters, Ara watched through a jagged crack in the plastic. The late afternoon sun cast long, distorted shadows against the brick, making the bullies look like giants. Park Jae-hoon stood over the unmoving girl, his expensive sneakers pristine despite the dirt, a smirk playing on his lips as he watched Seo-yun's eyes flutter and finally close. Pathetic, Jae-hoon spat, nudging Seo-yun's limp hand with his toe. She didn't even scream. Ara's heart hammered against her chest like a trapped bird. She saw the small, blood-stained bunny keychain lying inches from Seo-yun's pale fingers, a tiny splash of pink against the gray concrete. As the boys finally turned away, laughing about their victory and debating where to get tteokbokki, Ara waited until their footsteps faded into the indifferent hum of Seoul's traffic. She crawled out from her hiding spot, her knees scraping the gravel. The silence of the alley was suffocating. Seo-yun looked smaller than usual, her oversized school uniform bunched up, her breathing shallow and ragged. Ara reached out, her fingers trembling, and picked up the bunny keychain. Beneath it, Seo-yun's phone lay face down, the screen cracked but still glowing. Ara remembered the hushed conversation they'd had a month ago in the library. "If anything ever happens," Seo-yun had whispered, her eyes wide and serious, "don't call the police. They won't help. Call the gardener." Ara bypassed the lock screen and hit the single speed dial entry labeled with a simple leaf icon. The phone didn't ring, it simply connected. "Reporting," a voice answered. It wasn't the voice of a regular emergency operator. It was deep, toneless, and resonated with a terrifying, mechanical calm that made the hair on Ara's neck stand up. "Please," Ara whispered, her voice cracking as she looked at her best friend's bruised face. "Seo-yun. She's not waking up." Behind the gym, it was Jae-hoon and the others. They wouldn't stop. There was a half-second of silence on the other end, a silence so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the alley. "The gardener is coming," Han Tae-guk said. "Stay with the little bird, do not hang up." Ara huddled beside Seo-yun, clutching the bunny keychain to her chest. She didn't know who Han Tae-guk was or what a gardener did, but as the shadows stretched longer and the temperature began to drop, she felt a sudden, inexplicable shift in the atmosphere. The city outside felt quieter, as if the very streets were holding their breath. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but the first bolt of lightning had just been struck. The sterile, white light of the emergency room was jarring, a stark contrast to the deepening shadows of the city outside. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the frantic, rhythmic beeping of monitors that sounded like a countdown. Choi Min-yi moved through the sliding glass doors not as a grieving father, but as a cold front moving across the sea. He didn't run. He walked with a measured, predatory stillness that made the busy nurses freeze in their tracks. He was still wearing his tailored black suit from a board meeting, the silk shimmering under the harsh fluorescent bulbs, but the faint scar on his jaw seemed to pulse with a hidden heat. "Sir, you can't be back here. This is a restricted area," a young resident shouted, stepping forward with a clipboard held like a shield. Min-yi didn't even look at him. He didn't have to. Han Tae-guk, a mountain of a man with a shaved head and eyes that held the vacuum of space, stepped into the resident's path. He didn't raise a hand. He simply leaned in, his massive frame blotting out the light. The resident's protest died in his throat as he looked into the abyss of Tae-guk's gaze. It wasn't just a threat. It was the weight of an entire underworld pressing against his chest. Slowly, the doctor stepped aside, the clipboard trembling. The rest of the staff followed suit, pulling back against the walls like a receding tide, clearing a path that led straight to the trauma bay. Min-yi stopped before the curtain. For the first time in his life, his hand hesitated. He reached out, his long, disciplined fingers twitching before he pulled the fabric aside. Seo-yeon looked like a broken porcelain doll discarded on the high-tech gurney. Her soft features were obscured by a plastic oxygen mask, and a thick white bandage was already blossoming with a dark, ominous crimson at her temple. Her school uniform had been cut away to reveal the violent purples and blues blooming across her ribs. She looked so impossibly small against the vast, mechanical landscape of the hospital. Dr. Lee Sung-ho stepped toward him, his face grave and his hands stained with the reality of the girl's condition. "Are you the father?" Min-yi didn't answer immediately. He reached out and touched the small, cold hand that still had a trace of playground dirt under the fingernails. The warmth of his devotion clashed with the ice in his veins. The calculating, disciplined kingpin was being hollowed out by a raw, jagged grief that threatened to tear his composure apart. "Tell me," Min-yi said, his voice a low, vibrating rasp that carried the weight of a death sentence. "She has a grade III concussion and 3 broken ribs," Dr. Lee said, his professional voice wavering. "There is swelling on the brain. We won't know the full extent of the damage until the next 24 hours pass. Mr. Choi, these weren't just bruises. This was a sustained, intentional assault." Min-yi closed his eyes, and for a second the monitors seemed to skip a beat. When he opened them, the father was gone. Only the boss remained. He turned to Tae-guk, who was already waiting for the command. "Find out who did this," Min-yi whispered, the sound like dry leaves skittering over a grave. "I want the names of the boys. I want the names of their fathers. And Tae-guk, don't let the sun set on their ignorance." Would you like me to move on to Chapter 3, Institutional Silence, where the school attempts to cover up the crime? The heavy oak doors of the principal's office remained closed, but the silence inside was far from peaceful. Ms. Yoon Hee-rin sat across from Min-yi, her fingers twisting a damp tissue into a tight, shredded knot. She didn't look at the man sitting in the leather chair. She couldn't. To her, he was just a parent she didn't recognize from the luxury car line, someone she assumed lacked the pedigree of the prestigious families she served. "It was a tragic misunderstanding, Mr. Choi," she began, her voice brittle and rehearsed. "Children can be so boisterous during recess. The gym area is quite secluded, and it seems Seo-yeon simply tripped and fell against the equipment. A playground accident, truly. These things happen." Min-yi sat perfectly still, his hands resting flat on his knees. The lack of movement was more terrifying than a shout. Behind him, Han Tae-guk stood like a gargoyle carved from shadow, his presence making the room feel 5 degrees colder. "Dripped," Min-yi repeated. The word was a low, dangerous vibration. "My daughter has 3 broken ribs and a brain hemorrhage. Did she trip 3 times, Ms. Yoon? Did she fall onto a pair of designer sneakers? Ms. Yoon flinched, her face turning a sickly shade of gray. I understand you're upset, but we must think of the school's reputation. And the other boys involved come from very prominent, very influential families. Park Jae-hoon's father is a major benefactor. If we make this into something it isn't, if we use words like assault, the legal fallout would be devastating for everyone, including your daughter's future here. She was offering him a veiled threat, wrapped in the soft paper of institutional concern. She was banking on his fear of the influential men who own the city's light. She didn't realize she was talking to the man who owned the dark. You speak of the school's reputation, Min-yi said, standing up slowly. The sheer gravity of his movement forced Ms. Yoon to press herself back into her chair. You speak of influential fathers. You have spent so much time looking at the sun that you've forgotten how to see what moves in the night. He leaned over the desk, his face inches from hers. The faint scar on his jaw seemed to glow under the office lamps. You had a duty to protect my daughter. Instead, you chose to protect a bully's inheritance. You chose silence over her blood. Min-yi turned to Taeguk without breaking his gaze from the trembling teacher. The school's archives, Taeguk. Every email, every ignored report, every penny of Park Sung-tae's donations. I want the institutional memory of this place dismantled by dawn. Consider it gone, boss, Taeguk replied. As Min-yi walked toward the door, he paused at the threshold. Enjoy the silence while you still have it, Ms. Yoon. Tomorrow, the world will finally hear what happened behind that gym. The air in the narrow library aisle was stagnant, smelling of old paper, and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. Kim Ara was huddled between the stacks of historical archives, her knees pulled tight against her chest, her small frame nearly invisible in the shadows. She had been hiding there since the ambulance had taken Seo-yeon away, her mind a frantic loop of Jae-hoon's mocking laughter and the sickening sound of the final kick. A shadow fell across the floor, long and immovable. It didn't flicker like the school's faulty fluorescent lights. It was solid, a void that seemed to swallow the light around it. Ara looked up, her breath hitching. Standing at the end of the aisle was Han Taeguk. In the cramped space of the library, he looked less like a man and more like a force of nature, a mountain of dark wool and scarred knuckles. Don't be afraid, little bird, Taeguk said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that vibrated in Ara's chest. It wasn't the voice of a monster, but of the wall that kept monsters out. He knelt, a movement that was surprisingly fluid for a man of his size, bringing himself level with her. He held out his hand. In his palm lay the pink, blood-stained bunny keychain. You did well to call. Now I need the truth that the teacher is too cowardly to tell. Ara reached out, her fingers trembling as she took the keychain. The dam broke. The words came out in a jagged, frantic rush, a history of a year spent in terror. She told him about the lunch money Jae-hoon stole, the accidental shoves in the hallway, and the time Ms. Yoon had watched from the staff room window as they forced Seo-yeon to eat dirt, only to turn her back and pull the blinds. Jae-hoon said his father owns the police, Ara whispered, her eyes wide with a haunting, adult-like grief. He said even if we told, the school would just kick Seo-yeon out. Ms. Yoon told Seo-yeon to be more resilient. She said boys will be boys. Taeguk listened in a silence so profound it felt like the library itself was holding its breath. His face remained a mask of stone, but his hands, resting on his knees, tightened until the leather of his gloves creaked. He wasn't just recording a statement, he was cataloging sins. Does anyone else know? Taeguk asked. Just them, Ara said, her voice small. But Jae-hoon's father comes to the school every week. He brings envelopes for the principal. Everyone knows not to look. Taeguk stood up, the movement casting the aisle back into shadow. He looked down at the girl, the only soul brave enough to stand by his master's daughter. You won't have to hide anymore, Ara. The gardener is going to pull the weeds. He turned and tapped an earpiece. Boss, It's worse than the medical report, it's systemic. The father isn't just a businessman, he's the architect of the silence. And the teacher, she was the foreman. Clear the site, Minyi's voice crackled back, colder than the winter wind. And bring the witness home, she's under our protection now. Would you like to continue to Chapter 5? Arrogance of the Elite, where Park Sung-tae attempts to buy his way out of the disaster. The sliding glass doors of the private VIP waiting lounge hissed open, admitting a man who wore his power like a heavy, gilded cloak. Park Sung-tae entered with a brisk, proprietary stride, his silk tie perfectly knotted, and his voice booming with a confidence that felt like an assault on the room's hushed misery. He didn't look at the grieving families or the tired nurses. He looked only for the man who held the power to disrupt his son's future. Minyi sat in a low armchair, his eyes fixed on the distant, rhythmic flash of a red light atop a nearby tower. He didn't stand when Sung-tae approached. He didn't even blink. "Mr. Choi, I assume," Sung-tae said, not waiting for an invitation to sit. He dropped into the chair opposite Minyi, checked his gold watch, and sighed as if this were a tedious business meeting. "Look, let's be adults about this. It's a messy situation. Boys will be boys, and sometimes their high spirits go a bit too far. My son, Jae-hoon, is a passionate kid, and it seems your daughter was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time." Minyi's gaze slowly drifted toward Sung-tae. The silence he projected was so absolute it seemed to drain the sound from the air. Sung-tae, oblivious to the predatory stillness across from him, pulled a sleek leather checkbook from his breast pocket. "I've spoken with the school and the police. We've managed to keep the incident report flexible. Now I'm prepared to offer you a very generous settlement, 200 million won. That should cover the hospital bills and a nice vacation for the girl once she's out. In exchange, you sign a non-disclosure agreement and we agree this was a tragic playground accident. No harm, no foul." He slid a gold pen across the coffee table toward Minyi. 200 million, Minyi repeated. The words were quiet, but they carried a vibration that made the water in the glass on the table ripple. "It's more than you'd see in 5 years of work, I imagine," Sung-tae said, a patronizing smirk touching his lips. "Take the money, Mr. Choi. Don't make the mistake of thinking you can fight someone like me. I have friends in the Blue House. I have judges on my payroll. You have a broken child. Let's keep it that way." Minyi stood up. The movement was so sudden and silent that Sung-tae flinched, his smirk faltering. Minyi reached down, picked up the gold pen, and held it between his thumb and forefinger. With a sharp, effortless snap, the pen broke in two, black ink bleeding across Minyi's palm like a dark omen. "You think your friends can protect you from the dark," Minyi whispered, leaning over the table until his shadow completely engulfed the other man. "You think your money can buy the blood of my daughter, but you've made a fatal miscalculation, Sung-tae. You've brought a checkbook to a slaughter." Minyi dropped the broken pieces of the pen onto the unsigned check. "Keep your money. You're going to need it to buy your own coffin. Tae-guk, show this benefactor what happens when the gardener finds a weed." Tae-guk stepped forward from the shadows, his massive hand coming down on Sung-tae's shoulder with a grip that made the man's knees buckle. The era of negotiation was over. The era of erasure had begun. The rejection of the check was not a conclusion. It was the formal declaration of a siege. As Minyi stepped out of the hospital, the ink still drying on his palm like a bloodstain, the digital gears of his empire began to grind. He didn't need to fire a single bullet to destroy the world Ms. Yoon had built her life around. In the quiet, suburban darkness of her living room, Ms. Yoon Hee-rin was nursing a glass of wine, trying to convince herself that the accident narrative would hold. Then her laptop chimed. Then her phone. Then the tablet on the coffee table. In the span of 60 minutes, her life was systematically dismantled. First came the email from the Ministry of Education, notifying her of an immediate emergency suspension, pending a criminal investigation into gross negligence and evidence tampering. Before she could process the shock, a second notification arrived. Her personal bank accounts had been frozen due to suspicious third-party deposits, the very envelopes Park Sung-tae had been providing for years. While Ms. Yoon stared at her darkened screens in terror, a different kind of erasure was happening at the school. In a midnight session that lasted less than 20 minutes, the school's board of directors received a series of dossiers that made their blood run cold. They weren't just evidence of the assault on Seo-yeon. They were records of every board member's private sins, offshore tax havens, falsified credentials, and illicit liaisons. By 1:00 a.m., the board had voted unanimously to dissolve itself. By 1:15 a.m., the school's prestigious accreditation was placed under red review, and every contract associated with the Park family was terminated. Ms. Yoon sat in the dark as the power to her apartment suddenly flickered and died. In the silence, she remembered Min Ye's face, the scar on his jaw, the terrifying stillness of his eyes. She had thought he was a nobody because he didn't boast of his connections. She realized now that true power didn't need to shout. It simply removed the ground from beneath your feet. Across the city, in the sterile trauma bay, Min Ye sat by his daughter's bed, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. Taeguk entered silently and gave a single, sharp nod. "The institutional memory has been wiped, boss," Taeguk whispered. "Ms. Yoon is currently sitting in a dark room with no career and no allies. The board is gone." Min Ye didn't look up. He gently adjusted the stuffed bunny keychain that Ara had returned, placing it near Seo-yeon's hand. "That was just the foundation," Min Ye said, his voice cold and hollow. "Now we start on the house that Park built. I want his businesses hemorrhaging by sunrise." The systematic execution of Park Sung-tae's empire didn't begin with a roar, but with a series of quiet, lethal tremors in the financial markets. By 9:00 a.m. the following morning, the untouchable foundations of the Park Group were already turning to sand. Min Ye sat in his high-rise office, the walls made of reinforced glass that looked out over a city that didn't yet realize its hierarchy had shifted. "The logistics contracts," Min Ye said, his voice flat as he watched a live data feed of plummeting stock prices. "Sever them." With a single keystroke from a technician in the corner, the primary shipping routes for Park's manufacturing plants were diverted. Cargo ships carrying millions in raw materials were suddenly denied docking rights at ports owned by Min Ye's shell companies. On the highway, hundreds of trucks stopped in their tracks as their fuel cards were remotely deactivated. The flow of commerce, the lifeblood of Sung-tae's arrogance, was being strangled in real time. Then came the allies. The friends Sung-tae had boasted about at the hospital, the politicians, the judges, the police chiefs began to vanish from the board. They didn't go to jail, they simply went silent. One by one, they received a digital gift, encrypted files containing high-resolution evidence of the bribes they had taken from the Park family over the last decade. It wasn't an extortion attempt, it was a ghosting. Terrified for their own survival, these powerful men didn't just stop answering Sung-tae's calls. They deleted his existence from their records. By noon, Park Sung-tae was standing in his corner office, screaming into a phone that only gave him busy signals. His chief legal counsel had resigned via text. His bank had called in 50 billion won in short-term loans, citing a breach of morality clauses, buried deep in the fine print of contracts he had never bothered to read. "How is this happening?" Sung-tae roared at his empty foyer. "Who is doing this?" He still didn't understand. He thought he was in a business war, a battle of spreadsheets and influence. He didn't realize he was being hunted by a man who treated the economy like a garden, pruning away the rot until only the roots remained, exposed and vulnerable to the cold. Taeguk entered Min Ye's office, his phone displaying a map of Seoul. 6 red dots, representing Sung-tae's main revenue streams, had just blinked out and turned gray. "The swamp is nearly dry, boss. He's currently calling the police to report a cyber-terrorist attack. The captain we put on the payroll last year is the one who took the call. He told Sung-tae the filing system is down." Minyi stood up and adjusted his cufflinks. Good. Let him feel the helplessness my daughter felt when she reached for a phone that was being crushed. Now find the boys. If the father is the swamp, the sons are the vermin that live in it. It's time to bring them to the surface. The neon signs of the Mapo district flickered in the puddles, casting distorted ribbons of light across the pavement as Minsiak and D1 hurried toward the back entrance of an upscale karaoke bar. They had been summoned by a text from Jae-hoon's phone, or so they thought, promising a celebration for successfully burying the gym incident. But when the heavy, soundproof door clicked shut behind them, the upbeat K-pop music died instantly, replaced by a silence so thick it felt like being underwater. The room wasn't filled with classmates or gold-labeled bottles. Instead, two men in identical charcoal suits stood by the door, their arms crossed, faces as immobile as granite. In the center of the plush, U-shaped velvet sofa sat Choi Min-yi. He was pouring tea with a steady hand, the steam rising in a delicate plume that caught the light of his luxury watch. "Sit," Min-yi said. He didn't raise his voice, yet the boys felt their legs turn to lead. Min-seok, usually the louder of the two, tried to muster his usual bravado. "Who are you? We're friends of Park Jae-hoon. You can't just—" A sharp, metallic clack echoed through the room as Han Tae-guk stepped out of the shadows, placing a heavy, obsidian-handled knife on the table next to the teacups. D1 let out a small, strangled whimper. The mob mentality that had made them feel like giants behind the school gym was evaporating, leaving behind nothing but the raw, shivering cowardice of children who had realized they were no longer playing a game. "You like to watch," Min-yi said, finally looking up. His eyes were cold, abyssal mirrors. "You like to hold the phone and record. You like to cheer when someone's smaller than you can't breathe." He slid two tablets across the table. They didn't show the video of the beating. Instead, they displayed a comprehensive breakdown of their families' lives. Min-seok's father's gambling debts to a high-stakes house in Macau. D1's mother's secret involvement in an insurance fraud scheme. Every skeleton, every hidden shame, laid out in clinical, high-definition detail. "This is the world you live in," Min-yi whispered, leaning forward. "A world of shadows, and in the shadows I am the sun that decides when you burn." He picked up a tablet and played a recording of the boys' own voices from the previous day, laughing as Seo-yeon hit the ground. Hearing it in this room, under the gaze of a man who looked like he could swallow the city whole, the sound was hideous. Min-seok began to cry, the tears tracking through the expensive hair wax he'd spent an hour applying. "We didn't hit her," D1 blurted out, his voice cracking. "It was all Jae-hoon. He said he'd beat us if we didn't help. We just stood there." "Standing there is a choice," Min-yi said, his voice dropping to a terrifying velvet softness. "And now you have another choice. You can go to the police and give a full, unedited confession about everything Jae-hoon has done over the last year. Or I can introduce your parents to the people they owe money to." He stood up, adjusting his cuffs. "You have 10 minutes to decide who you fear more, a bully with a rich father, or the man who is currently erasing that father from existence." Park Jae-hoon sat in the back of his family's armored limousine, his expensive sneakers propped up on the leather upholstery, scrolling through his social media with a bored, restless energy. He was waiting for his father to call and tell him the Seo-yeon problem had been scrubbed from the school records. He wasn't worried. He never was. In Jae-hoon's world, consequences were things that happened to people who couldn't afford to pay them off. The limousine slowed to a halt, but they weren't at the private club. They were in a deserted stretch of the industrial docks, surrounded by towering rusted shipping containers that blocked out the city's neon glow. The driver's partition didn't slide down. Instead, the doors locked with a heavy, electronic thud. The tinted window hummed as it lowered, revealing not his father but a massive man with a shaved head and a gaze that felt like a physical weight. Han Tae-guk stood there, silent as a tombstone. Behind him, leaning against a black sedan, was Choi Min-yi. Get out, Tiguk commanded. Jaehoon's bravado flared, a reflexive shield of inherited arrogance. Do you know who my father is? He'll have your heads for this. Open this door right now. Minyi stepped forward, his face illuminated by the flickering yellow light of a nearby street lamp. He held up a phone, Jaehoon's father's phone. He pressed a button and a recording played. It was Park Sung-tae, his voice broken, sobbing as he begged an unknown creditor for one more day, one more hour before his entire life was seized. Your father is currently signing over the deed to your house to pay for the debt he didn't know he had, Minyi said, his voice a chillingly calm melody. He isn't coming for you, Jaehoon. He can't even afford the gas for this car anymore. The realization hit Jaehoon like a physical blow. The invisible safety net he had spent his life leaping into had been cut away. For the first time, he looked at the man with the scar on his jaw and saw not a poor parent, but the apex predator of the world his father had only pretended to rule. You can't touch me, Jaehoon whispered, his voice losing its edge, becoming the high-pitched plea of a child. I'm a minor, the police. The police are busy processing your father's fraud charges, Minyi interrupted. He tossed a thick folder into the boy's lap. Inside were the signed confessions of Min Seok and D1, detailing every assault, every theft, and every moment of Seo-yun's suffering. You relied on the silence of others to be a monster, but silence is a commodity, Jaehoon, and I've bought all of it. Minyi leaned into the car, his eyes boring into Jaehoon's soul. I won't lay a finger on you. That would be too quick. Instead, you are going to watch as the world forgets your name. No more expensive sneakers. No more elite schools. Just the cold, hard reality of being exactly what you called my daughter. Nothing. As the limousine's engine died, leaving them in the hollow silence of the docks, Jaehoon began to shake. The lesson wasn't about pain. It was about the terrifying weight of being truly, utterly alone. Would you like to proceed to Chapter 10, the gala confrontation, where the final public fall of the Park family occurs? The grand ballroom of the Shilla Hotel was a sea of shimmering silk and clinking crystal, the air perfumed with the scent of lilies and desperate ambition. Park Sung-tae moved through the crowd with a forced, manic energy, his face a mask of sweating composure. He was here for the annual Blue Harbor Gala, his last hope to secure a private loan from the city's elite and save his crumbling empire. He hadn't told anyone that his home was in foreclosure or that his son was missing from his private school dorm. He only knew how to play the part of the victor. A toast, Sung-tae announced, raising a glass of vintage champagne to a circle of high-ranking officials, to progress and to the enduring strength of the Park Group. The toast was met with a chilling, hollow silence. The circle of men didn't raise their glasses. Instead, they parted like a curtain, their eyes fixed on the grand staircase. Choi Min-yi descended slowly, the black silk of his tuxedo absorbing the light of the chandeliers. Beside him walked Han Tae-guk, whose sheer presence seemed to dwarf the room's opulence. Min-yi didn't look like a guest. He looked like the owner of the building, the city, and the very air Sung-tae was breathing. The Park Group, Min-yi said, his voice cutting through the hushed room like a razor through velvet. An empire built on the bruised ribs of a child and the silence of cowards. Sung-tae's glass trembled. Mr. Choi, this is a private event, you aren't on the list. I am the list, Min-yi replied, stepping into the center of the ballroom. He signaled to the AV booth. The massive projection screens, meant for corporate highlights, suddenly flickered to life. It wasn't a promotional video. It was a clinical high-definition dossier of every bribe Sung-tae had paid, every safety regulation he had bypassed, and most devastatingly, the unedited footage from the school gym's hidden backup server. The room gasped as the brutal images of Seo-yun's assault filled the space, followed by the audio of Sung-tae offering a settlement to buy her blood. This is the man you call a benefactor, Min-yi addressed the stunned elite. A man who hides behind a checkbook while his son plays at being a god. Today, the checkbook is empty. Minyi pulled a single document from his jacket, the master deed to the park group's headquarters. He dropped it onto the floor at Sungti's feet. I bought your debt at dawn. I liquidated your holdings at noon. By the time this gala ends, you will have exactly what you deserve. Nothing. The officials and judges Sungti had called friends turned their backs in unison, moving away from him as if his failure were contagious. Sungti collapsed to his knees in the center of the ballroom, the shimmering lights now feeling like a spotlight on his ruin. Minyi looked down at him, his expression one of cold, surgical indifference. You told me I couldn't fight someone like you, Minyi whispered. But you forgot. A gardener doesn't fight the weeds, he simply removes them. Minyi turned and walked out, the crowd parting in silent, terrified reverence. The house of cards had fallen, and in the silence that followed, the only sound was the sobbing of a man who had finally realized that the dark he feared was standing right in front of him. The rhythmic hiss of the ventilator had finally been silenced, replaced by the soft, natural sound of breathing that Minyi had spent a week praying to hear. The hospital room was dim, illuminated only by the soft glow of the moonlight filtering through the blinds and the steady, reassuring green pulse of the heart monitor. Minyi sat in the same chair he hadn't left for 48 hours, his fingers interlaced with Seo-yun's small, pale hand. A tiny tremor moved through her fingers. Minyi froze, his breath hitching in a way that would have shocked his underworld rivals. Then slowly, almost painfully, Seo-yun's eyelids fluttered. She turned her head toward him, her brown eyes unfocused and glassy at first, before they finally locked onto his face. Appa, her voice was a ghost of a whisper, cracked and dry, but to Minyi, it was the most powerful sound in the world. I'm here, little bird, he murmured, his voice thick with a raw emotion he had buried decades ago. I'm right here, you're safe now. The door creaked open and Dr. Lee Sung-ho stepped in. He checked the monitors, his professional composure softening as he saw the girl's open eyes. He performed a quick series of neurological tests, tracking light, squeezing fingers, while Minyi watched him with the intensity of a hawk. After a few minutes, Dr. Lee stepped back and motioned Minyi toward the corner of the room. The swelling has receded significantly, the doctor whispered, a genuine smile touching his tired face. Her cognitive responses are sharp. There's no sign of permanent motor impairment. Mr. Choi, she's a fighter. With the right physical therapy, she'll make a full recovery. Minyi closed his eyes for a brief second, the tension that had held his spine like a steel rod finally snapping. It was the only victory that mattered. The destruction of the Park family, the seizing of their assets, the dismantling of the school, it all paled in comparison to the steady light in his daughter's eyes. Can I take her home? Minyi asked. Soon, Dr. Lee replied, but she'll need a quiet environment, no stress, no reminders of what happened. Minyi looked back at Seo-yun, who had drifted into a peaceful, natural sleep, her hand still resting near the pink bunny keychain. He thought of the new school he had already purchased, the one currently being staffed by the most elite, vetted educators in the country. He thought of the high walls of his estate, now reinforced by a security detail that would make a head of state jealous. She will have everything, Minyi said, his voice returning to its low, cold resonance. The world she wakes up to will be a different place entirely. The monster was still there, lurking in the shadows of his soul, but as he watched his daughter's chest rise and fall, he knew the monster now had a singular, holy purpose: to ensure that Seo-yun never had to be afraid of the light again. The iron gates of the Choi estate swung open with a silent, heavy grace, admitting the black sedan into a world where the air seemed stiller, protected by high stone walls and a perimeter of men who moved like shadows. Seo-yun sat in the back seat, her hand enveloped in her father's. She looked out the window at the manicured gardens, her gaze lingering on a gardener who paused his work to bow deeply as they passed. For the first time, she noticed the bulge of a radio under his jacket and the way his eyes scanned the tree line instead of the flowers. Inside the foyer, the house felt warmer than she remembered, yet more profound in its quiet. Choi Min-yi helped her out of her coat, his movements gentle and precise. He looked like the same man who had tucked her in every night, the father who smelled of expensive sandalwood and read her stories in a soft, melodic voice. But as she watched him hand her coat to a servant, she saw the subtle shift in the room. The staff didn't just serve him, they breathed in rhythm with him. "Would you like some tea, Seo-yun?" Min-yi asked, kneeling so he was eye level with her. His expression was open and kind, the coldness of the ER and the ballroom nowhere to be found. "Appa," she said softly, her voice steady now. "Kim Ara told me about the gardener. She told me the boys are gone, that everyone who was mean is gone." Min-yi didn't flinch. He didn't offer a hollow lie about playground accidents or coincidences. He simply reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his thumb grazing the faint, fatting scar at her temple. "The world was loud and unkind to you, little bird. I simply made it quiet again. You never have to worry about those voices ever again." She looked at the small, pink bunny keychain resting on the hall table, placed there by Han Taeguk like a sacred relic. She understood now that her father's love wasn't just a feeling, it was a fortress. The poverty the bullies had mocked was a shield he had built to give her a normal life, but the shield had been replaced by a sword. "I'm not afraid anymore," Seo-yun whispered, stepping into his arms. Min-yi held her, his eyes looking over her shoulder toward the window where the sun was setting. The Park family was a memory, the school was under new management, and the city was at peace because he had bled the chaos out of it. He was still her father, the one who would make her favorite porridge and help her with her math homework. But as the shadows grew long in the hallway, Seo-yun knew that the world remained beautiful only because the man holding her was the most terrifying thing in it. The silence of the house was absolute, a perfect, curated peace. And as Min-yi carried her up the stairs, the only sound was the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a king who had secured his kingdom for his heir.